The car looked like it belonged in a junkyard. Rust-eaten, canvas draped, hitched to a trailer that had seen better decades. It didn't belong anywhere near polished chrome and spotlights. But Caleb Turner had hauled it here anyway, and right now every camera in the room was pointed at him. Eleanor Whitmore stood before the crowd in a tailored suit, her voice smooth and cold as marble. "Remove it," she said. "Now, have it taken to the yard and crushed." Her finger pointed directly at the car at the $120 mistake this grease-stained mechanic had dragged onto her event. Sophie, 7 years old, gripped her father's sleeve. The crowd waited. The tow truck idled at the gate. Nobody in that room knew what was hidden under that canvas. Nobody except Caleb. And whatever it was, Eleanor Whitmore had just made the most expensive decision of her life. 3 weeks before that Saturday, Caleb Turner had been standing in a field full of strangers, squinting into the late afternoon sun, watching a farm get swallowed by numbers. Estate auctions in rural Kentucky were not glamorous events. Folding tables, cardboard lot numbers, a man with a microphone who talked too fast and smiled too wide. The kind of crowd that came dressed in work boots and left with things they probably didn't need. Caleb fit right in. He always did. That was part of his gift, and also part of his curse. He was the kind of man people looked past. He'd driven 2 hours from Harlow Creek that morning, following a listing he'd spotted, buried in a local classifieds page. Schools in the county were out for a teacher workday, so Sophie had come with him. She'd spent the drive reading in the passenger seat and hadn't complained once about the early start. Most of the lots were farm equipment furniture, a few tractors. Nothing worth the trip on paper. But there was one line easy to miss: miscellaneous vehicle-covered barn storage. Unknown condition. Unknown condition. Most people read that as a warning. Caleb read it as an invitation. The barn sat at the back edge of the property, half its boards gray with age. Inside, behind a disassembled hay baler and 3 decades of accumulated dust, a shape crouched beneath a canvas tarp. Caleb pulled one corner back, just one. He didn't need more than that. His hand went still. Beneath the grime and surface, rust. Beneath the years of neglect that had buried it like something the earth was trying to reclaim, he saw what it was. The roofline, the flared fenders, the particular curve of the door that no factory after 1967 had ever replicated. He let the tarp fall back into place and took one slow breath before walking back to the auction tent with his hands in his pockets. He paid $120 for it. Nobody else had bid. The man running the auction gave him a look somewhere between pity and amusement as he took the cash. Caleb signed the transfer paperwork, loaded the car onto his trailer without removing the tarp, and drove home through the blue dusk of that Tuesday evening, with Sophie asleep in the passenger seat, her head tipped against the window. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found. Not his neighbor, not the guys at the shop, not even the one mechanic at Turner Auto who might have understood. Some things you keep close, not out of greed, but because the world has a way of complicating things it doesn't yet understand. He'd been working Whitmore Motors events for 4 years. It wasn't prestigious work. He ran the logistics crew, kept the trailers moving, made sure the vehicles arrived undamaged and on schedule. The pay was decent enough for a man raising a daughter alone, and the overtime helped. When Sophie's school had an away trip the same weekend as the Whitmore Charity Classic. Caleb's solution was straightforward. He brought her with him. He also brought the car. The event grounds occupied the entire east wing of the Whitmore estate, a sprawling property outside Lexington, where Eleanor Whitmore held her annual classic car showcase. 50 years of the company's history. On display in manicured rows, polished to mirror shine, each vehicle lit like a museum piece. The kind of event where the parking lot alone cost more than most people's yearly salaries. The logistics area sat behind the main exhibition hall, a wide service corridor flanked by temporary fencing, invisible to the guests. That was where Caleb positioned his trailer. Sophie had a folding chair, a book, and a juice box. She was content. The car sat under its tarp at the far end, the same way it always did when he transported it. He hadn't planned on anyone seeing it. Eleanor Whitmore rarely came through the logistics corridor. That was the thing about people who ran large operations. They saw the front of everything and none of the back. But that afternoon, something had pulled her off her usual path. A scheduling issue with one of the display vehicles, a disagreement between two of her senior staff, some fraying edge of the event that required her personal attention. She moved through the corridor with her assistant at her heels, and her eyes scanning everything with the particular efficiencies of someone who had never tolerated disorder. She was dressed in deep charcoal, a suit that probably cost more than the car under that tarp, and her dark hair was pulled back with a precision that suggested she had not arrived at her position by accident. Eleanor Whitmore was 53 years old and had built Whitmore Motors from a regional dealership into a national brand over the course of 2 decades. She had a reputation for taste for vision and for zero patience with anything that diminished the image she'd worked to construct. She saw the trailer first, then the tarp, then the rust bleeding through at the edges. She stopped walking. "What," she said not loudly, "is that?" Caleb was 15 feet away reviewing a clipboard. He looked up. "That's mine," he said. Eleanor Whitmore turned toward him with the particular slowness of a person deciding exactly how to respond. Her eyes moved from him to the trailer, to the canvas-covered shape beneath it, and something shifted in her expression. Not anger, yet but the precise cold predecessor to it. "Yours," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. I transported it with my rig. It's staying covered. It won't be in the way." One of her assistants had already stepped forward, murmuring something about the event layout, about optics, about a television crew that would be filming the corridor approach for a segment later that afternoon. Eleanor held up one hand, and the assistant went quiet. "This is a charity showcase," Eleanor said, her voice carrying now drawing the attention of the nearby crew members who'd been pretending not to listen. "We have sponsors, press collectors, who paid significant money to be here today. I will not have a rust bucket sitting in frame of a live broadcast." A few people had drifted closer. One of the event photographers had his camera half raised, uncertain whether this was something he should be documenting. 2 guests who'd wandered in from the main hall watched from near the fencing. Caleb set his clipboard down on the trailer's edge. "It's in the logistics corridor," he said. "Your film crew doesn't need to come back here. That's not your call to make." Eleanor looked past him toward a pair of event staff standing by the gate. "I want this vehicle removed from the property. Have it taken to the salvage yard and crushed. Find the tow service we have on standby." Sophie looked up from her book. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward aggressively or make any large gesture. He simply looked at Eleanor Whitmore directly and said, "I'd strongly suggest you don't do that." The quiet that followed was not comfortable. Eleanor turned back to him. "Excuse me, I'm asking you to leave the car where it is." His tone was even, not pleading, not threatening, simply certain, in the way that people are certain about things they know deeply and privately. "You don't know what's under that tarp." She actually smiled at that. It wasn't a warm smile. "I know exactly what's under that tarp," she said. "I can see the rust from here. I can see the trailer it's sitting on. And I can see the kind of man who brings something like that to an event like this." She glanced briefly at Sophie, who had gone very still in her folding chair. "Take your daughter, take your vehicle, and get off my property before I have you escorted out." There was laughter somewhere in the small crowd that had gathered. Not everyone, just a few, the reflexive laughter of people who want to be on the right side of power before they know what the right side is. Sophie didn't cry. Not yet. She was 7, and she had her father's ability to go quiet when things became serious. She watched him waiting to see what he would do. What he did was walk to the front of the trailer and stand in front of the car. Not dramatically. He didn't spread his arms or say anything. He simply positioned himself between the car and the direction from which the tow truck would have to approach, and he stood there. "Caleb Turner." Eleanor's voice had dropped a degree. "You are a contracted employee of this event. If you refuse a direct instruction, that contract is void. Do you understand what you're risking right now?" "I understand it," he said. "Then move." No. The television crew had arrived by then, 2 of them, with a shoulder-mounted camera drawn by the energy of the gathering crowd, the way cameras always were. The red light blinked on. Caleb saw it in his peripheral vision and didn't look at it. Eleanor saw it too. For one moment, something crossed her face, a calculation rapid and professional. Then she turned toward the event staff near the gate. "Get the tow truck," she said. Now, the radio crackled. Someone confirmed. Someone else moved. Sophie set her book down on the folding chair very carefully, like she wanted to remember exactly where she'd left off. She walked to her father's side and stood next to him, her small shoulder pressed against his forearm. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't say anything. She just stood there the way he was standing, quiet and present, and entirely certain that whatever was under that tarp was worth standing in front of. The tow truck entered the corridor from the far gate, its engine low and deliberate. Eleanor Whitmore watched from 12 feet away with her arms at her sides, her expression composed, her decision made. She had no idea. Not one person in that corridor, not the film crew, not the photographers, not the collectors who'd leaned over the temporary fencing to watch, had any idea what they were standing around. They saw rust. They saw a canvas tarp. They saw a mechanic in work clothes and a little girl beside him and a CEO in a charcoal suit, and they arranged those pieces into a story they thought they already knew. The tow truck stopped 10 feet from the trailer. The driver climbed out and looked at the car, then at Caleb, then at Eleanor. "Ma'am," the driver said. "Hook it up," Eleanor said, "and when you're done, take it straight to the yard." Caleb Turner looked at Eleanor Whitmore for one long moment, the look of a man who has just watched someone make an irreversible mistake and is deciding whether to say so, and then he said nothing. He simply stood his ground. The crowd waited. The red light blinked. Sophie pressed closer to her father's arm, and the tow cable began to unroll. The cable made a sound like a slow exhale as it unrolled across the concrete. The driver moved toward the front of the trailer, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who did this for a living and felt nothing particular about it. He crouched near the hitch, glanced back at Eleanor for confirmation, and reached for the hook. Sophie made a sound. Not a word, just a small, involuntary catch in her throat, the kind of sound a child makes when they understand that something is about to happen, and there is nothing they can do to stop it. She pressed harder against her father's arm. Caleb felt it, that small pressure, and his jaw tightened by a degree that nobody would have noticed unless they were looking for it. He was still standing his ground. But he was alone. There was no lawyer behind him, no colleague stepping forward, no friendly hand on his shoulder. The crew members who'd worked alongside him all morning had drifted to the edges of the corridor, watching with the careful neutrality of people who understood that choosing a side was a luxury they couldn't afford. The collectors who'd leaned over the fencing had their phones out now. The television camera blinked its red eye. Eleanor Whitmore stood 12 feet away with her arms folded and her expression composed, and the world arranged itself around her the way it always had in her favor by default. The driver's hand closed around the tow hook. Sophie's eyes filled. She didn't wail. She wasn't that kind of child. But the tears came anyway, one at a time, tracking silently down her face, while she kept her chin level and her shoulder pressed against her father's arm, because she was 7 years old, and she had decided that if he was standing, she was standing too. The camera caught it. The photographer, whose finger had been hovering over the shutter for the last 3 minutes, finally pressed down, and the click of it was barely audible over the low rumble of the tow truck engine. Eleanor saw the tears. Everyone saw the tears. "Continue," Eleanor said. The word landed in the corridor with a flatness that made two people visibly flinch. One of her assistants looked away. The driver, to his credit, slowed, not from conscience necessarily, but from the dawning awareness that this moment had become something more complicated than a removal job. Then a voice came from the far end of the corridor. "Hold on a moment." The voice was unhurried, a little dry, carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent a lifetime being listened to in rooms full of people who thought they knew more than they did. The crowd near the fencing shifted. A woman made her way through late 60s, silver-haired in a camel-colored blazer that managed to look both practical and expensive. She walked with a cane she didn't seem to lean on heavily, more a habit than a necessity, and her eyes were already fixed on the trailer before she'd finished crossing the corridor. Margaret Hayes had been invited to the Whitmore Charity Classic in her capacity as a consulting appraiser for 3 of the collections on display. She had been doing this for 31 years. In that time, she had walked through barns, warehouses, shipping containers, and flooded basements, and she had learned absolutely and without exception to distrust her eyes until she had used her hands. She was using them now. Without asking anyone's permission, she walked directly to the trailer, lifted one edge of the canvas tarp, and looked underneath. Her expression didn't change. She lowered herself slightly, one hand on the trailer's edge, and looked at something near the rear wheel. Well, then she stood back up and let the tarp fall. Margaret. Eleanor said, her tone carefully modulated, respectful, because Eleanor knew who Margaret Hayes was, and aware because the cameras were still rolling. "This vehicle is being removed from the property. It's a logistics matter." Margaret looked at Eleanor with the mild patience of someone who has heard many confident people say many incorrect things. "What you're about to send to the salvage yard," Margaret said, at a volume that carried clearly to everyone in the corridor, "is a 1965 Shelby Cobra 427. Nobody moved. The driver's hand, still holding the tow hook, went still. "I can't confirm full provenance standing here," Margaret continued, "but the frame stamping I just looked at is consistent with the original Carroll Shelby production run. The bodywork is correct for that year. The rust is surface rust, the kind you get from storage, not from damage." She looked at the tarp, then at Caleb. "How long has it been in a barn?" Caleb's voice was even. "Best I can tell, since around 1972. Margaret nodded, like that confirmed something. 50-plus years of barn storage would account for the surface condition. The structure underneath is likely intact." She turned back to the crowd with the manner of a professor addressing a lecture hall. "A verified 1965 Shelby Cobra 427 in restorable condition. And I mean restorable, not restored. Last sold at auction for $2.7 million. The silence that followed was of a very different quality than the one that had preceded it. $2.7 million. Spoken plainly, without drama, in a logistics corridor, at an event where the priciest car on the main floor was listed at $400,000. Someone in the crowd said something under their breath. Someone else repeated the number back as if checking whether they'd heard it correctly. A collector near the fencing leaned forward so suddenly he nearly knocked into the man beside him. The television camera swung in a slow arc from Margaret to the trailer, to Eleanor, and back again, and the operator behind it had the particular stillness of someone who understood they were filming something that would matter later. Eleanor Whitmore's face did not crumble. She was too controlled for that. But something shifted behind her eyes, the rapid internal machinery of a person running calculations they hadn't expected to need. Her composure was intact, but it was the composure of a woman gripping something very tightly, so it would not shake. She started to say something. Something professional, something measured, something that would reframe the situation and put her back at the center of it. Her mouth opened. Nobody was listening. The collectors had begun to move toward the trailer. 3 of them, then 5, converging with the specific magnetic pull of people who recognized that something rare had just surfaced in front of them. The crew members who'd been watching from the edges came forward. The television crew repositioned, stepping past Eleanor without acknowledging her, their lens pointed at the tarp and at Caleb and at Margaret Hayes, who had stepped back and folded her hands and was watching with the expression of someone who had just set a match down and stepped away. Sophie wiped her face with the back of her hand. She was still standing beside her father, but she was no longer crying. She looked up at the trailer, at the canvas-covered shape under it, with the wide, recalibrating eyes of a child who was beginning to understand that the thing she'd been standing in front of was larger than she knew. Eleanor made 2 more attempts to address the crowd. Both times the people she was speaking to were already turning toward the car, toward Caleb, toward Margaret's quiet expertise. The event she had built and controlled and curated for 3 decades continued outside in the main hall, the polished chrome, the spotlights, the collectors in their blazers. But the story had moved. The center of gravity had shifted into this service corridor around a rust-covered tarp and a man in work clothes, and nothing Eleanor said was going to pull it back. The photographer's camera clicked again and again. The phones came out. Someone uploaded something, a photo, a clip 30 seconds of Margaret's voice and Sophie's tears, and within the hour it was moving through the internet with the momentum of things that touch a nerve the world didn't know it had. By the time the afternoon had softened into early evening and the last of the main showcase guests had begun collecting their programs and moving toward the parking lot, the corridor behind the exhibition hall had become the most photographed place on the property. Caleb stood near the trailer and answered questions from 3 collectors who'd introduced themselves with the careful formality of men who wanted something and were smart enough not to say so yet. Margaret Hayes sat in a folding chair someone had produced for her and spoke with the television correspondent in the measured, precise language of someone who had spent a lifetime translating value for people who didn't know how to see it. Eleanor tried one more time. She composed a statement. Her communications director helped her deliver it to the press, something about the event's commitment to the preservation of automotive history, about the importance of proper documentation and verification about Whitmore Motors' role in championing the classic car community. It was polished. It was correct. It said absolutely nothing about what had actually happened, and every journalist in the corridor knew it. The cameras stayed on the trailer. By 7 o'clock, as the grounds crew began rolling up the event, Banners, one of Eleanor's senior assistants, found her in the private lounge off the main hall, standing at the window with a glass of water she hadn't touched. The video of the little girl has 300,000 views, the assistant said carefully. It's trending in 3 states. Eleanor didn't respond. The car is confirmed on record as having been sold at a Kentucky estate auction 6 weeks ago. Public record. The buyer is listed as Caleb Turner. The assistant's voice remained neutral professional. Legal says there's no actionable claim. The car belongs to him. Eleanor set the glass down on the windowsill. Outside in the corridor, she could see Caleb through the glass, talking to someone, answering something unhurried, in the same way he'd been unhurried all day, as if the afternoon had not detonated around him, but simply proceeded according to a plan he'd always understood. She made herself watch him for a moment. Then she turned from the window. "Tell him I want to speak with him," she said. Caleb listened to Eleanor's assistant deliver the request, nodded once, and told Sophie he'd be back in 10 minutes. Sophie, who had acquired a warm soda and a renewed interest in her book, said okay without looking up. They met at the edge of the corridor, away from the remaining crew, away from the last few collectors and the cameras that had finally been lowered for the night. Eleanor had traded her public composure for something quieter and harder to read. She looked like a woman who had rehearsed this conversation 3 times on the way over and was already aware that none of those rehearsals were going to hold. "I'd like to discuss a resolution," she said, "for the inconvenience today. There are legal implications to consider the attempted removal, the public nature of..." "I'm not interested in a settlement," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I'm prepared to be generous. The car's value once verified." "The car isn't for sale." Something crossed her face. Not quite surprised Eleanor Whitmore had not survived 2 decades in business by being easily surprised, but something adjacent to it. The conversation had not gone in the direction she'd mapped. Money was the instrument she knew. It was the one that had always worked. "Then what do you want?" she asked. Caleb looked toward the far end of the corridor, where Sophie sat in the folding chair, with her book and her soda, her legs swinging because the chair was a little too tall for her. "An apology," he said. "Not to me." He looked back at Eleanor. "To her." The silence between them was long and specific. Eleanor Whitmore, who had given keynote speeches to rooms of 500 people, who had negotiated acquisitions and managed boardrooms and built a company with her own intelligence, and Will stood in a logistics corridor at the end of her own event, and understood for the first time that day that she had nothing left to negotiate with. The car had never been the point. She saw that now. The money wasn't the point either. Caleb Turner didn't want her money. He didn't want acknowledgement or press coverage or to be written into the story of the Whitmore Charity Classic as anything other than what he was. He wanted his daughter to be looked at by the woman who had dismissed her father in front of cameras and strangers and a tow truck driver and told that it was wrong. Eleanor looked at Sophie. Sophie was reading oblivious her small feet, swinging slowly in the evening air. For the first time all day, Eleanor Whitmore had nothing to say. Eleanor walked across the corridor alone. She hadn't asked her assistant to come with her. She hadn't brought anyone, no communications director, no legal counsel, no buffer of professional presence to soften the distance between what she had done and what she was about to do. She crossed the concrete with the deliberate step of a woman who had decided something and intended to see it through before she could think better of it. Sophie heard the footsteps and looked up from her book. She didn't say anything. She just watched Eleanor approach with the calm, unreadable attention of a child who has already cried once today and does not intend to do so again. Her feet had stopped swinging. The soda can sat forgotten in her lap. Eleanor stopped a few feet away. Up close, Sophie was smaller than she'd seemed from across the corridor 7 years old, and slight, with her father's same quality of stillness, that particular composure that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with character. She had his eyes, too, the kind that looked at you directly without performing anything. Eleanor had faced boards of directors. She had navigated hostile acquisitions and public relations disasters, and the specific sustained pressure of being a woman who refused to make herself smaller in rooms that expected her to. She had stood at podiums and delivered difficult news to large rooms of people, and never once felt what she was feeling now, standing in front of a 7-year-old girl with a library book in her lap. "Sophie," she said. Sophie said, "Hi." Eleanor crouched down, slightly bringing herself level. It was an unfamiliar position physically, and in every other sense. "I want to tell you that I'm sorry," she said. "What I said today about your father, and about his car, was wrong. I didn't know what I was looking at, and I made a judgment I had no business making. And I said it where you could hear it, and where a lot of other people could hear it, and that wasn't fair to him or to you." Sophie considered this. Her expression was thoughtful in the way children's expressions are when they are taking something seriously and haven't decided yet what to do with it. "He knew what it was," Sophie said. "He always knows." Eleanor looked at her. "The car." Sophie glanced toward the trailer, then back. He saw it in the barn, and he knew right away. He didn't tell anybody because he said some things are hard to explain until people can see for themselves. She tilted her head slightly. "He's like that with a lot of things. He sees what stuff is worth before anyone else does." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the words themselves, a child defending her father straightforwardly the way children do. but something in the simplicity of it landed with a weight that Eleanor hadn't anticipated. She had spent the better part of 30 years measuring value. She had built an entire enterprise around the proposition that she understood what things were worth: cars, companies, collections, moments. She had walked into a logistics corridor that afternoon and looked at a canvas tarp over a rusted frame and made in 3 seconds a judgment she'd considered complete. And a 7-year-old girl was sitting in a folding chair, telling her without cruelty and without any apparent awareness that it was devastating that some people could see what she had missed. "Your father is very good at what he does," Eleanor said. Her voice was quieter than it had been all day. Sophie nodded. "I know." There was a beat in which neither of them spoke. Eleanor straightened up slowly. She had come to deliver an apology, and she had delivered it, and it had cost her something she hadn't put a name to yet. Not reputation that was already a separate problem playing out in real time across 300,000 phone screens. Something more interior than that. The specific, uncomfortable deflation of a certainty you've held for a long time and have just watched disproven. She looked toward Caleb, who was standing 20 feet away, talking with one of the collectors, his back partially turned, giving them the space he'd understood she would need. He hadn't watched. That struck her as deliberate and generous in equal measure, the gesture of a man who wanted the apology given, not witnessed. Eleanor Whitmore turned and walked back across the corridor the same way she'd come alone, and nobody stopped her. Margaret Hayes found Caleb as the last of the grounds crew began stacking the temporary fencing near the far gate. She walked with her cane over the uneven concrete and stopped beside him at the trailer's edge, and they stood there for a moment, looking at the tarp the way two people look at something they both understand differently and are working out how to talk about it. "I should tell you," Margaret said, "that I'm sorry for the way that played out. I didn't intend to turn your afternoon into a television event." "You stopped them from putting a hook on it," Caleb said. "I'll take the trade." Margaret smiled small, dry, the smile of someone who had been in enough complicated rooms to appreciate a man who didn't hold grudges. "I've been doing this for a long time," she said. "I've seen cars like this disappear, sold for scrap, parted out by people who didn't know what they had." She looked at the covered shape on the trailer. "You knew." "I had a strong feeling," Caleb said. "You paid $120 for a strong feeling." "It was a very specific feeling," Margaret laughed genuinely. Shortly, the way people laugh when something lands unexpectedly. Then she reached into the breast pocket of her camel blazer and produced a card, which she held out to him. "I work with a small team. Specialists frame restoration, original upholstery, period correct engine rebuilding. We've brought 6 cars of this caliber back from worse condition than this one." She waited while he took the card and looked at it. "I'm not asking you to sell it. I'm asking you to let us help you do it right." Caleb turned the card over in his hand. The paper was heavy, the printing clean and unornamented. Margaret Hayes, it said, and a phone number and nothing else. "What does right look like?" he asked. 18 months, maybe 24. Original components where they can be sourced, period-accurate replacements where they can't. Every decision documented and verified. You'd be present for the major milestones, you'd make the calls. She watched him. "The car stays yours. The restoration stays honest. What it's worth when it's done is your business." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the trailer. Then he looked at the card again. The collectors who'd approached him earlier had come with the specific energy of men who already knew what they wanted, who had done rapid arithmetic in their heads the moment Margaret had said 2.7 million, and had spent the rest of the afternoon constructing careful, reasonable-sounding arguments for why selling now before restoration costs, before the complication of provenance paperwork, was actually the smarter move. One of them had quoted him a number significantly higher than he'd expected from a first offer. Caleb had listened politely and said he'd think about it, which was the most courteous way he knew to say no. The car had been in a barn for 50 years. It had been hidden under a tarp in the back of his trailer for 6 weeks. It had been that afternoon 40 seconds from being hooked to a tow cable and driven to a salvage yard. It had survived all of that. It could survive another 2 years of careful work done by people who understood what it was. "I'll call you," he said. Margaret nodded once satisfied and tucked her cane under her arm while she pulled on her jacket. "Don't wait too long," she said, not unkindly. The world has a way of developing opinions about things once they've been on camera. She walked away across the emptying corridor, and Caleb watched her go, and then he looked at the card in his hand for one more second before folding it into his shirt pocket. Sophie was asleep by the time they cleared the highway and turned north onto the county road that would take them back toward Harlow Creek. She'd managed another 40 minutes of consciousness after Eleanor's apology, long enough to watch the last of the crew finish their teardown, long enough to eat the sandwich Caleb had retrieved from the cooler in the truck cab, long enough to ask him with the directness that was her most consistent quality whether the car was going to be okay. He'd told her yes. She'd accepted this without follow-up, which was how she handled things she believed. The questions were for the things she wasn't sure about. Now she was curled against the door, with her jacket pulled up to her chin, her book wedged between the seat and the console, her breathing slow and even. The highway lights passed over her face at intervals, pale gold, then shadow, then pale gold again, and Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the radio turned low. Behind them, the Cobra sat under its canvas the same way it always had. The trailer was hitched. The roads were quiet. The night had that particular emptiness of a Saturday that had spent all its noise and was finally done. Caleb thought about the barn. He thought about the way the light had come through the gap in the siding that afternoon, 3 weeks ago. A single bar of late sun cutting through the dust landing on the edge of the fender where he'd lifted the tarp. He'd known in that moment, the way you sometimes know things before your brain has finished processing them, a bone-level recognition that something true was right in front of him. He hadn't been able to explain it to anyone. He'd tried once years ago with a different car, and he'd watched the other person's eyes go polite and distant, the particular look people give you when they've decided you're enthusiastic, but not credible. After that, he'd learned to keep the knowing private until the thing itself could do the talking. The Cobra had done its talking today. He hadn't planned for it. He hadn't brought the car to the Whitmore event to make any kind of point. It had simply been with him, the way it always was when he was on a job, because he wasn't comfortable leaving it in the shop yard overnight. The confrontation had not been something he wanted. None of it had been something he wanted. He would have been content for Eleanor Whitmore to walk past that trailer and never look twice at it, to run her event and give her speeches and direct her television crew and leave a single mechanic with a covered car alone in a logistics corridor. She hadn't. And then she'd ordered it destroyed in front of his daughter, and something in Caleb had gone very still and very certain, the same way it had in the barn, the bone-level recognition that this moment was real, and that walking away from it would cost something he couldn't get back. He hadn't been thinking about value. He'd been thinking about Sophie standing beside him, watching the world arrange itself into a lesson he didn't want her to learn. That some things get dismissed before anyone looks at them. That the loudest voice in the room gets to decide what matters. That a man in work clothes and a canvas-covered trailer doesn't get to stand in the same corridor as people who wear tailored suits and imported shoes. He'd stood there so she wouldn't have to learn that. Or at least, so she wouldn't have to learn it without also seeing someone refuse it. The county road curved west, and the highway lights thinned, and the dark came in closer on both sides, the tree line running along the ridge above the valley. Caleb rolled the window down 2 inches. The air came in cool and smelled like cut grass and someone's distant fire pit, and Sophie shifted in her sleep but didn't wake. He thought about Margaret's card in his shirt pocket. 18 months, maybe 24. Every decision documented and honest, the car staying his, the restoration staying true. He already knew he was going to call her. He'd known before she'd finished the offer the same way he knew things before his brain had caught up. The car had waited 50 years in a barn. It could wait a little longer. There was something right about that, about not rushing it, not selling it before it was whole, not letting the afternoon's chaos turn into a transaction just because the numbers were large and the collectors were eager. The car didn't belong to the market. It didn't belong to anyone's auction estimate or insurance appraisal or the 300,000 people who'd watched a clip of his daughter's tears and formed instant, passionate opinions about what should happen next. It belonged to the process of being understood. That was the only thing Caleb had ever believed about valuable things, not that they deserved to be monetized, but that they deserved to be seen correctly. You couldn't rush that. You couldn't shortcut it with a check. Sophie stirred. Her eyes opened, halfway saw the dark road and the dashboard lights and closed again. "Dad," she said, not quite awake. "Yeah." "Is Eleanor going to be okay?" Caleb considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think she learned something today," he said. "That's usually okay eventually." Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, she looked sad when she said sorry. "People usually do." "Is that bad?" "No," Caleb said. "It means the sorry was real." Sophie processed this behind closed eyes. Then she pulled her jacket tighter and went the rest of the way back to sleep. And Caleb drove on through the dark with the radio low and the window cracked and the trailer steady behind him. When they got home, he didn't unload the car that night. He parked the rig in the side yard the way he always did, unhitched the trailer, and left the Cobra right where it was. He carried Sophie inside without waking her, set her down, in her bed, pulled the blanket up to her shoulder. He stood in her doorway for a moment. She'd stood in that corridor beside him. She hadn't asked him to explain. She hadn't needed the context or the provenance or the auction estimates. She'd just pressed her shoulder against his arm and stayed. 7 years old, and she'd understood the essential thing, which was that some things are worth standing in front of. He went back outside. The yard was dark and still. Crickets. The far sound of a truck on the highway 2 miles east. Above the ridge, the sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you only got this far from town. Caleb stood beside the trailer and put one hand on the canvas and left it there for a moment. Under it, the Cobra waited, the way it had waited for 50 years in the dark of that barn patient, in the way that things are patient when they are made right and simply need someone to come along and recognize it. He wasn't going to rush it. He wasn't going to sell it to the first man who quoted him a number with enough zeros to make most people say yes without thinking. He was going to call Margaret Hayes on Monday morning and begin the long, careful work of bringing it back, piece by piece, to what it actually was. And when it was done, when every component had been sourced and fitted and documented, and the engine ran the way it was built to run in 1965, he thought he might drive it. Not to an event, not to a showcase. Just drive it the way it was meant to be driven on an open road with the windows down, because some things don't exist to be displayed. They exist to be understood by the people patient enough to look. He took his hand off the canvas. He went inside and washed his hands at the kitchen sink, the grease coming away slowly under the warm water, the way it always did at the end of a long day. The house was quiet. Sophie's light was off. The card from Margaret Hayes sat on the counter beside his keys, where he'd set it when he came in. Tomorrow, he'd have questions to answer, calls from journalists probably, and at least 2 texts from the collectors who'd given him their numbers, with the careful ease of men planting seeds. The video of Sophie would still be there, growing, doing whatever it was doing in the world without his participation. The afternoon would have consequences he hadn't fully mapped yet. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the car was home. His daughter was asleep. The stars were out over the ridge, and the valley was quiet. and Caleb Turner stood in his kitchen in the particular stillness of a man who has done what he needed to do and can at last stop. He turned off the light. Outside in the side yard, the cobra sat in the dark, waiting unhurried exactly what it had always been,